Hi, my name is Beth Green, and I'm here today to talk to you about fear, ego, and the case for higher consciousness. I don't think we like to admit just how much we are being guided every day by fear, and how much we're being guided every day by ego. Most of us like to believe that we are making reasonable decisions, that we're really nice people, that we're doing the right thing. And so we think we're being motivated by being practical, or being sensible, or being generous, or whatever story we tell ourselves about how we are being motivated. There's a laugh in the room already. If we started to look at our day and we analyzed moment by moment, we might be horrified to see what is truly motivating our decisions. For example, let's say we want our child to study and do well, do their homework. What is really guiding that? We can say, I'm a responsible parent. I'm caring. That is what's motivating me. Well, maybe, maybe not. Maybe what's motivating me is if my child doesn't do, quote, well in this class, then that child won't be able to get a scholarship, so that 20 years from now they won't be a doctor and they won't be able to support themselves, and then I'll feel like a terrible parent because in the end my child will be a bum. You think that that isn't what's really going on in your head? Guess again. Or some other version of that, which would be something like, my mother always told me I was no good, and if my child doesn't do well, and doesn't do well in school, and then doesn't do well in life, then my mother will be proved correct. And so on, and so on, and so on. Or let's take, I myself haven't done very well, I feel ashamed of myself, but now I have a child and they're going to redeem me in some way by doing really well. Each one of these is motivated by some fear of how we are going to be seen, how we're going to look to ourselves, how we're going to look to other people. Can anyone not identify with this? So many of our decisions, for example, what am I going to eat for lunch? Well, I'm eating the correct food because I think it's the correct food, because I'm afraid that I'm going to have a heart attack, or because I'm afraid I'm going to gain weight, or I'm afraid that I'm going to lose weight, or because I'm afraid of how I'm going to look in my bikini in the summer, or because I'm feeling anxiety and I'm just afraid, and if I don't stuff myself right now, I'm going to freak out and punch somebody. Look at all the fears that could be motivating what I eat for lunch. So, if we look at our day and we're scrupulously honest, we will notice how much we are dominated by fear. So that means that so much of our behavior that we think is rational is actually being guided by some force which is within us, which is fear. And sometimes our action is being guided by fear that's in the collective. Do you remember when the United States invaded Iraq? It was because of weapons of mass destruction that did not exist. But the fear was being drummed up in our society. There was a collective fear. Oh my God, we're vulnerable. As though we aren't. I know it isn't 7/11. It was 9/11, where the planes crashed into the World Trade Center. Oh my God, we're vulnerable. We have got to protect ourselves. Who can we invade to make ourselves feel more secure in the world? As we have all discovered, invading Iraq did absolutely nothing to make us feel and be more secure in the world. In fact, it made us more insecure in the world. So did I wake up that morning and think, oh, I have a fear of a bomb blowing up the World Trade Center? No. But once it happened, the collective fear, which was being fed by those who had their own motivations for wanting to invade a country and maybe look powerful, prove something to themselves or their parents, that collective fear then just took so many of us away. And we were too scared to realize it. I had a client at that time, because I was saying, you know, I don't think this is the right move, because that was what I was getting from God. So, and the client said to me, well, I have connections in the military and in military intelligence. And she told me this. She said, and they've told me, just between us, that there's way more going on here than meets the eye about these weapons of mass destruction. So not only did she have fear, but she also had a little ego. Now there is, of course, a huge connection between fear and ego, but I'm going to use ego in the kind of popular sense of how we look. She was then in the know about what was going on in the Middle East, and she informed me that that's the way it was. And she would never question that, because to question it would take away the ego, which made her feel very special by being in the know. Think about the complex number of factors of fears and ego that came together. How dare those people humiliate the United States of America? All of these factors coming together, creating a mistake, a big mistake. Well, most of us would think it's a mistake. There may be a few who are still out there who think it wasn't a mistake. But I would say the popular opinion today is that wasn't a very smart war. We are always guided. The question is by what? The ego is designed to make us aware of what's happening in our environment so that we can make intelligent decisions to take care of ourselves. It's supposed to let us know when we're cold, when we're supposed to put on a sweater. It's supposed to let us know when we're hungry. It's supposed to tell us, I think you better change the oil. There's a light on in the car when you turn it on that says, oil. Great, very smart. That ego, which is aware of our individual existence, is taking care of business. Now, if we were all in the oneness all the time, in the sense of being in this amorphous oneness state, we would float around and we wouldn't even notice that the oil light was on, because we would be in a high state of meditation. We would be like in a psychedelic experience. We need to be grounded, and the ego helps us to ground by helping us to be aware of, oh my God, there's a foot of snow outside. Maybe I should get the shovel, rather than looking from above and saying, the peace and tranquility on earth is very elevating. So the ego has a purpose, and it is to ground us in our individual reality. But unfortunately, it dominates us. Because if we're only focused on our individual reality, we make equally stupid decisions. I mean, how would the society work if, when there was 12 feet of snow outside my door, I decided that I was going to plow my house and 5 feet onto the road? Because that's all I can see. That's all I can afford. That's all I can think about. We need the collective, a higher consciousness, to say, oh my God, it's not just your house, it's not just this town, it's the highway coming for miles and miles. And who's taking that look, that higher perspective? Now this sounds like a kind of silly example, but it really is extremely important, because if each one of us is making decisions only based on what we see and what we know, we could make a lot of bad decisions. What we need is to have a higher perspective, the perspective that sees the entire road system, that in the perspective that knows that another 2 feet of snow is going to be dumped in the next 24 hours because it's gone to the weather forecast. We can't make intelligent decisions. It would be like an ant, one single ant, making the decision of the fate of humanity. That ant does not have the consciousness to understand the entire perspective of what is needed. But that ant is perfect for seeing that crumb and picking it up and bringing it home, and being a scout and letting other ants know what's going on. So if you think about it that way, you could say that we and our egos have ant consciousness. Except that ant consciousness is supposed to work collectively and seems to do that very well, whereas we humans seem to have a lot of trouble with that. If we could only acknowledge that each one of us is just a little ant, we might all be better off. But instead what we do is we think of our consciousness as being the higher consciousness. We know best, don't we? I can't tell you how many times a day I've come to the conclusion that I know more than anyone else in the room. I certainly know more than God. Now, well, I'm going to get to God in a minute. So, our very narrow perspective causes us to make a lot of mistakes as a collective. So, let's say during the housing boom, I went out there and I wanted to sell my house for $300,000 more than I paid for it, and then I had to go out and buy another house that was $300,000 more than it would have been last week, and so on. And I'm just going out there and I'm trying to make money hand over fist, and I'm trying to take advantage, and I'm trying to maneuver myself as best I can in the circumstances. And that seems very reasonable. But if you take thousands and thousands of people who are doing the same thing, only thinking about themselves, what you end up is with a housing crisis, because we had a boom and a bust. And there's no higher consciousness that's regulating this and saying, you know, I don't think it's really right for you to be getting $200,000 more than this house is worth, because, you know, next year that house is going to crash. It's like, hey, make hay while the sun shines. This one is getting that much money. I'm going to get that much money. I have to get that much money, because if I'm going to buy that house, I have to get this much money out of that house. If you follow what I'm saying, each person is making a decision that appears to be really good for yourself. But in the end, it's really bad for the society. We are always in the ant consciousness unless we make the decision that we're going to look for a higher authority and a higher source. Now let me speak a little bit about the relationship between fear and ego. Since the purpose of the ego is to ground us into our individual reality, it is going to experience a lot of fear, because as that one ant, hey, it's easy to get wiped off the face of the earth. I mean, I don't want to admit how many ants I have killed. Not that I want to, but you know, when I see them going in my food, I kind of lose myself. And I'd like to shoo them out the door, but sometimes I go, you know, I get desperate to get rid of them. I'm killing these other creatures. I'm not proud of it, but I am. And it kind of feels like that, doesn't it sometimes? Don't you feel like you're just that expendable? Say you're driving down the freeway. Think of all the cars. I mean, aren't you kind of like an ant on the freeway? Isn't it scary? Remember what it felt like to be really little, really young. Everybody was bigger. You looked around. Then you've got your own house where everybody's bigger, except maybe some of your siblings. And then you can hit them, and the ones that are bigger than you will hit you, or take advantage of you, or make you look like a fool, or use you, or get you to go out there and bring, oh, would you get me this? Would you get me? They fool you. You know, you feel real vulnerable in the world. And you're completely vulnerable to your parents, who may or may not be that well. Some of our parents are alcoholic, or mentally ill, are just strung out, are nervous, are anxious, are depressed. and they're out of control emotionally, or they're cold, or they're distant, and it's hard to feel, and they may be doing the very best they can, but it's really hard to feel safe, and sometimes our parents are mean, are just downright mean. Or sometimes our parents are just being themselves, but we're so vulnerable that we feel the impact of it. It's like being an ant hit by a Mack truck, because that's what it feels like when we're children. You know, we're so impacted by every look. I remember my mother controlled me completely just by the look. Like, that was enough. I never had to be hit my whole life. The look was enough, or that was, yeah. These people are like gods to us. You know, they hold our lives in their hands. And then you go to school, and then there's a teacher who stands up in front of the classroom who's going to give you an A or a B or a C or a D. You know, and you feel your vulnerability one more time, and then you're vulnerable to the bullies, and you're vulnerable, and even as a girl, I mean, you're vulnerable to being rejected, you're vulnerable to bully girls, you're vulnerable to being unpopular. And it's a fearful universe. And then there are horrible, traumatic things that happen to us too. Being molested, being beaten. And it's fear. Now, our consciousness of our individual existence, we live in that reality. We understand that it's a dangerous place. And we're looking for a way to make ourselves safe. So fear is an important part of our psychology, because it's telling us that there's a threat there that we have to take care of. But then we get locked into that fear, and we become fearful. And our egos latch on to fear because the ego tells us, I know how to take care of you. This world is a scary place. Let me just tell you how. This is how you should act, this is how you should be, and our egos, which is our separateness, start telling us who to be and how to be to make ourselves safe in the world. Fear and ego, hand in hand. In fact, some of us have noticed as we've aged and we're out of those situations that our egos will make up fear that's not even there in order to convince us to go along with their program. The program of our own egos, the way we've been trained to think and feel and be. So in this particular talk, I'm not going to go into the genesis of the ego and what to do about it, but I am bringing forward that reality that the ego has developed strategies for survival and coping from a very, very young age, and they're very connected to the fear that we carry in our guts. And so it's extremely difficult for us to not be dominated by our fear and by our egos. And we don't admit it, because most of us have stories about ourselves, about who we are, because we're really nice, or we're really considerate, or we're just being tough, or we're being practical, or we're being this, and then we don't look underneath it to see the emotion that can be driving all of that behavior. So what happens when somebody says to us, hey, let's talk to higher consciousness. Let's get a new perspective. Let's be guided by something other than our own self-interest and our own fears. It's like, new. Are you crazy?
No, thank you.
I mean, it makes perfect sense. You know, is the ant volunteering for electrocution, or what do you call that when execution? The word, I mean, the ant isn't volunteering, but it's just doing its thing, and it may get executed in the process, but it's not consciously going out there to get executed. Well, think about us. You know, I'm not going to say this because my girlfriends might not like me. That's like volunteering to be executed. We know how terrible it is if your girlfriends don't like you. You're going to be alone. If you're going to be alone, everybody's going to talk about you. Think about being a little girl sitting there in the cafeteria alone. What will people think of me? I will be lonely. They think I'm a loser. All that painful stuff. I'm not going to say this. I'm not going to stand up to the bully and the taunting or the racism or whatever it is in a situation like this. I need these people for support. I spoke to a lovely woman just a couple of months ago who was working, very spiritually oriented woman, who was working in an environment of people who were quite racist. And she would not say a word about it because she liked the people and she didn't want to lose their friendship. And I know that was not guided. I know that was based on, I need this job desperately and I want to be liked. And those are two fears, you see. The fear that I'm going to lose the job and the fear that I'm not going to be liked. It just came together. That motivated her to not confront the racism. I am not going to be guided to give this to you because I need it. My ego tells me that I need this. If I give it to you, I won't have it anymore. I'm not volunteering for execution. If I have a sweater and it's freezing and I give it to you, I'm going to die. What are you, crazy? Unless I have been raised to look sacrificing and it feels more important to look like a good person than it is to be warm. Then I will give you the shirt off my back because I want you to think highly of me. And then I'm still being dominated by my ego. I'm still not being guided by divine consciousness because I'm now trying to maintain an image of myself in front of me and you that I developed when I was a child as a coping mechanism that my ego has developed so that I will be safe in this world. So if I say to you, I want to be guided to you, your first reaction may be verbally yes, because you may want to look like a spiritual person and a guided person, but inside you may be going, not if it interferes with my marriage. If I do this or that or change in these ways, I may lose the love of my husband or wife. If I feel guided to be honest in my marriage, my husband won't like me. And now I can rationalize that and say, well, and I have 3 children to support. So, thank you very much. If I am guided to sell my house $200,000 less than I could get on the market, I'm going to say, hell no. What are you, crazy? I'm not even going to hear it. I would not hear that divine guidance. If I don't do this, I can't buy this house, or I can't retire, or what about me? Higher consciousness? Higher perspective? Divine consciousness? Not when it interferes. Not when it interferes with what I want to eat for lunch. Not when it interferes with making a living. I have known many therapists who I know are intuitive and could be doing better work. And when you get right down to it, many of them are not confronting their clients because they're afraid the clients will leave. What do you call that? That's ego and fear, being guided by ego and fear, rather than letting yourself be guided by the higher consciousness. So, hey, it sounds like I'm making the case for not having higher consciousness. Wasn't the topic of this talk fear, ego, and the case for higher consciousness? What is the case for higher consciousness? Well, if you're looking at it from the big picture, you could say, well, you know, you're not going to get out of your house if you only plow in front of your house, because if the road isn't plowed all the way to your house, you're not going to get out of this alive anyway. So, okay, so there's a little bit of, self-interest in there. Okay, I'm going to go for the higher guidance because that guidance is going to get me out of the house and it's going to get I'm going to get down the plowed road. So, sure, I'm going to go with that higher consciousness thing because it's smarter. It's going to make my life easier. Oh, yes, and haven't we heard that? People who get into being guided for the purpose of manifesting what they already wanted. So that's just a little trick, isn't it? A little trick of we're not really being guided. We're still being dominated by fear and ego. So, okay, so you're saying that I shouldn't want to be guided by higher consciousness because it's going to make my life better? Because if I listen to higher consciousness, I will get the right guy. Or if I listen to higher consciousness, I can get a parking space. Or if I listen to higher consciousness, my life will open and there will be roses on the path in front of me. There it is, the case for higher consciousness. No, that is not the case for higher consciousness. That's still the case for ego and fear, isn't it? Because then I'm not going to do the things that I'm being guided to do. I'm only going to do the things that I'm being guided to do that I think are going to bring me what I already wanted. So what the heck is the case for higher consciousness? This is what I'd like to say. Once we have acknowledged that we are usually being guided by fear and ego, then we also can acknowledge how much anxiety that kind of life produces in us. It makes sense, doesn't it? I'm filled with anxiety. I'm filled with fear. I'm filled with the need to prove myself, which the ego is always trying to do. Right? And I'm being driven by these energies that are negative, that come to dominate. But I thought you said, you could say to me, that the ego and fear are closely aligned, and that's perfectly reasonable because we're little ants, and I need to be aware that, oh yeah, the signal is going on in my car that says, change the oil, change the oil. If I didn't have fear that the car would blow up, I would never do the smart thing. So if you need to, don't you need to have fear and ego running your life? This is where we get to talk about the perspective of higher consciousness and the integration of ourselves. You could think of higher consciousness in terms of levels. You could say, from the perspective of me, I need to get as much money for my house as I possibly can. From the perspective of the whole town in which I live, if we jack up the prices of housing, there's a lot of people who can't buy. That means that they're going to be out. If we look at the perspective of the economy as a whole, this bubble is going to burst and we're all going to suffer. So if you think about it in those terms, you can see that the ant perspective, which we naturally carry, is limited and isn't ultimately for the highest good of all, and isn't ultimately even in our highest good. It's only in our immediate short-term interest, because many of us got stuck, amusingly enough, because of that same housing bubble, which gave us all that money, put us really upside down. Isn't that fun? Because it's such a great example of what happens. We need to move to that next level of consciousness. Now, that next level of consciousness you can think of as the integrating intelligence that says, if we do this, then there's this, and there's this, and there's this, and there's this. There's all these factors that I, the ant, cannot see. So you can think of it as higher intelligence. And higher intelligence is intelligence that is broader and more integrated, that can see the whole picture. Well, now, is that beginning to sound a little bit better? It's like, oh, maybe it is better to listen to that higher intelligence because it sees the big picture. Now, let's look at this on a deeper level. Many of us believe that we are, in fact, aspects of the divine consciousness. I think many of you probably believe that. What does that mean? That means if you look in the stream, that you're a drop of water in the stream, and I'm a drop of water in the stream, and we're all impacted by what makes the stream healthy. If somebody dumps toxins here in the stream, I'm going to get poisoned all the way down here. I could sit there and say, well, it doesn't matter, you see, because I'm not up there, but the stream flows. And before you know it, I'm polluted too. That is extremely true when it comes to consciousness. Remember when I was talking about the invasion of Iraq? The fear that may have started here grew and grew and grew and started to permeate all kinds of normally nice and reasonable people. Think about a lynch mob. Would you ever think that you would be capable of lynching someone? And yet, some perfectly nice person, some 50 or 100 years ago, was in a lynch mob and lost their rudder because of the power of the collective consciousness. We are all aspects of the collective consciousness. We are all impacted by everything that goes on in the collective consciousness. If that is the case, don't you think that it would be really helpful to us to be in a collective consciousness that in itself was more light, more pure, more happy, more energized, more harmonious? We don't get there from fear and ego. So now we're looking at a second reason to defer to higher consciousness. It can impact the whole and create an environment in which we are all so much happier. I know that when I'm with happy people, I feel happier than when I'm with miserable people. If my husband is angry, I'm immediately triggered into anger, even though I may try to do something about it. It takes work to intervene with my consciousness. Higher consciousness is what is needed for the collective consciousness to be on a higher level. Because it is on that level. It's not the individual's consciousness. It is the collective consciousness. Now let's take this a little deeper. What aspect of the collective consciousness am I going to connect to? We've already talked a little bit about how we're impacted by what happens collectively. If that collective consciousness is in fear, I'm going to be in fear. If the collective consciousness is happy, I will be happy. If the collective consciousness is getting high, I'm much more likely to give in to my addictions. If the collective consciousness promotes smoking and alcohol, I'm much more likely to get into it when I'm 10 years old or 15 years old. Now, that means that I can't deny that I'm being impacted by that collective consciousness, and yet I haven't got a clue as to how to change that collective consciousness. Do you? Do any of us have that power to be able to transform consciousness as a whole? Each one of us has some power to change our own consciousness. But we don't have the power to change consciousness as a whole, except to do it collectively and to be guided by a wisdom that we do not have. Because when we come together, we have only opinions. We don't have perspective. I'm still looking from the ant's perspective and trying to impose it on a higher dimension. Say, oh, well, I know what should happen. It should be like this. We should have abortions. We shouldn't have abortions. We should have guns. We shouldn't have guns. Everybody's arguing. We all have opinions. We're all seeing something. We're all being dominated by fear. Those of us who want to see no guns are afraid that people are going to use guns and hurt each other. Those people who want guns are afraid someone's going to shoot them. So we have nothing but opinions. We don't have a direction because we don't know how to shift the collective consciousness, how to change our world, how to make it different. We have lived in this reality all our lives. If you think about it now in terms of here is the collective consciousness on the planet, and there's a cloud hanging over us, and then there's a sun above it. If we're under that cloud 24/7 all our lives, we don't know what the sun looks like. We need to get through the cloud. We need to defer to the sun. We need to go to the sun, and we need to say, hey, where are you? I've heard tell that there's a sun. When the sun starts coming through, we go out there and we celebrate. And then and we open ourselves up more and more to that higher consciousness, that level of consciousness, which isn't being dominated by the individual ego. Now, this still may sound abstract to you. Let me take it to another level. If we are, as we were just discussing earlier, all aspects of the divine consciousness, everything is an aspect of the divine consciousness. The guy who shoots you is an aspect of divine consciousness. The guy who heals you is an aspect of divine consciousness, because there is only oneness. There is only, I call it God because it's the shortest word that I can use, but we can call it oneness, we can call it the source, we can call it Buddha, we can call it anything we want, but we are all part of it because there is only one reality. And so what are we referring to when we're talking about God? Am I talking about the rapist, who is an aspect of God's consciousness because there is nothing but God? Is that what I'm referring to? Am I talking about fear, which is an aspect of God's consciousness because it's part of the consciousness of the whole that is God, because God is either everything or nothing? Am I referring to an aspect of consciousness that I'm going to be dominated by and guided by, like my needs, my house, my feelings? Or am I going to be asking to be connected to the highest level of integrated consciousness, which is what we normally mean when we talk about God or the source? What we're looking for is that feeling of flow and harmony and integration. I am an aspect of God. Every fear that I have, every thought that I have is part of God. I am not a shameful human being. I am part of God. But if I am only guided by that aspect of God, which is being manifested as me, I am being dominated by an aspect of God's consciousness, which is me. And I am not open to the highest level of integration of God's consciousness, which is what we typically are looking for when we go to a church or an ashram, or we go in to meditate. We're looking for that place of harmony and integration. That's what we're looking for. So what is the case for higher consciousness? That when we are left alone as the fragment, we are blind. We are hurtful to ourselves and others. We are driven. We are fearful. We don't have peace. When we connect to that highest level of integrated consciousness, we feel integrated. We say, yes, I'm scared of that, but I know that this is the right thing, and I'm going to do it anyway. So the child will stand up to the bully and say, don't bully that girl because it's wrong. And that child will not be afraid of getting beaten up because it's not being dominated by the normal fear of a human being. There is a connection to a sense of power and empowerment that can only come from the level of integrated consciousness that is beyond us as individuals. We can be guided from that level of consciousness. We can work on it, and in this series, we and I am going to do everything that we can to help each one of you to develop the God-given gift that you already have to be guided, your ability to connect to the divine, your ability to connect through your intuition, however that looks. Because that is also a gift from the universe. We are not only fear and ego. We are also the connection of the divine. We are aspects of the divine. It is our birthright. It is our connection. We are made of the same stuff that God is. We're just caught up in our fragmented ego-based consciousness. We all have it in us. But we haven't all developed that capacity. And our society does not teach us how. Like anything that's valuable, we have to work for it. We have it, we have glimpses of it, but many of us who have great intuition have not developed that intuition and honed it so that it can often get mixed up with our egos. It's a lifetime of work to continually clear ourselves of the domination of aspects of ourselves so that we can connect to the whole. And why would we want to? Because from that narrow perspective, as I've demonstrated already, I think we cannot solve our problems because we don't have the answers. And from that level of consciousness, of fear and ego, we are going to live in a place of fear and ego. And it's going to be painful, and we're going to feel driven, and we're going to feel ill at ease. And because there is an alternative, which is to connect to the highest level of integrated consciousness, which we call God, where there is a sense of harmony and peace that goes beyond what we are experiencing every day under the cloud. And finally, we will feel good about ourselves. We will have a sense that we are willing to be part of something bigger than ourselves. We will have a sense of well-being because we're making decisions based on higher consciousness. We will be willing to take risks and say, even if this did not work out the way my human mind thinks it should have, I was guided to do this, and I am at peace. We will be willing to die in the process because death will no longer make us afraid, because we will know that there's something beyond what we're experiencing here, and we will welcome that connection. In other words, the case for higher consciousness is that it feels good. And I'm not talking about going into outer space and becoming ungrounded, because no, I haven't said that we don't have an ego and that we don't have fear. We need that grounding, but we have to choose what we are going to be guided by. Every moment of every day, there is something guiding us, whether it's hunger pangs, fear, a headache, ambition, or whatever. And we have to, as conscious beings, or I should say we are privileged to, as conscious beings, decide what will guide us. Will it be our narrow self-interest? Will it be our fear? Will it be our ego? Or will it be the source? Will it be the highest level that God has to offer us? And when we do, we become part of the evolution of consciousness itself. But that's a subject for another day. Thank you.